If the production of AI servers, high-end smartphones, and advanced defense electronics suddenly ceased to function, the modern world would effectively seize up. We caught a glimpse of this during the 2020 pandemic. Missing a few essential microchips meant automotive dealership lots sat empty for months, and consumer electronics faced year-long delays. While those delays were caused by broad logistical failures, the modern supply chain has a far more localized vulnerability. Most of the advanced processors used in those products are manufactured on one small island in the Western Pacific. The 2020 shortage was a disruption in shipping and demand. A complete halt of production on this island would stop the assembly lines of the global tech economy. This specific manufacturing node is controlled by a company called TSMC. This chart shows the scale of their monopoly. In the fabrication of leading-edge 3-nanometer chips, the ones found in every high-end AI processor and smartphone, TSMC controls roughly 90% of the global market. This creates a loop of total dependency. Apple, Nvidia, and the US military are direct customers, but the reliance extends to mainland China, which still lacks the domestic equipment needed to manufacture these chips at scale. Because there is no global strategic reserve of advanced silicon, losing this single point of failure would instantly freeze an estimated $6 trillion of global economic output. This supply chain is concentrated in the Taiwan Strait. It is a shallow, 180-kilometer wide channel separating the island from mainland China. It is one of the most congested shipping lanes on Earth and sits directly within reach of China's coastal naval and missile infrastructure. This proximity is the basis of the silicon shield theory, the argument that because both Washington and Beijing need these chips to function, neither side can afford to destroy the foundries. However, an adversary wouldn't need to launch a physical invasion or damage the plants to break the chain. They could simply use a customs quarantine or a naval blockade to throttle exports. Halting those exports for even a few months would trigger a multi-trillion-dollar global contraction that analysts say would dwarf any economic shock seen in the post-war period. There is another way to isolate the island that is difficult to see from the surface. Beneath the waves of the strait lies a second, more vulnerable layer of infrastructure. Over 95% of all global internet traffic travels through physical fiber-optic undersea cables. In late 2024, a Chinese-flagged vessel severed 2 major cables in the Baltic Sea, and Taiwan has faced a parallel pattern of cable breaks near its own coast. This offers plausible deniability. A cargo ship can simply drag its anchor across the seabed, severing the link without the escalation of a naval battle. This creates a digital blockade, cutting off Taiwan's ability to coordinate its military, manage its banks, or facilitate the trade its economy depends on. This method of isolation is already being tested, providing a way to paralyze the tech economy without firing a single missile. Western governments are now racing to build a backup. The US CHIPS Act has allocated tens of billions of dollars to bring advanced semiconductor fabrication back to American soil. TSMC is leading this effort, constructing massive new fabrication facilities in Arizona and Japan. As this timeline shows, these facilities won't be fully operational for a long time. It can take 10 years to build the specialized environment required to manufacture high-end chips, leaving a massive window where there is no domestic alternative to Taiwan. This leaves the global tech industry in a fragile position. The manufacturing of our most essential technology remains concentrated on one island that currently sits on a geopolitical fault line. We tend to think of the modern world as a frictionless digital web, a system powered by cloud data, AI, and instant satellite connections. But beneath that digital surface, the global economy is heavy and physical. It runs on thousands of massive cargo ships and the raw fuel required to move them. Every single day, millions of barrels of oil and countless tons of manufactured goods are forced to squeeze through just 2 incredibly narrow ocean pathways. If either of these physical geographic valves is restricted, the resulting supply shocks trigger a chain reaction felt across almost every major market. Look at the Middle East. If you want to move energy out of the oil-rich Persian Gulf by sea, there's exactly one oceanic exit. This is the Strait of Hormuz. At its tightest point, the gap separating Iran and Oman is only 21 miles wide. Under normal conditions, roughly 20 million barrels of oil pass through this tiny space every day. That single flow represents roughly 20% of all the oil consumed on the planet. Most of that fuel heads east. China, India, Japan, and South Korea together receive 69% of everything that leaves the strait. In early 2026, the US-Israel war with Iran turned this geographical bottleneck into an active conflict zone. As Iran began threatening commercial ships passing through, daily oil throughput collapsed by nearly 30% compared to the previous year. To restore commercial traffic, the United States Navy maintains its Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, committing heavy military resources to guard this tiny stretch of water. The world's greatest superpower parks a massive naval armada inside a tiny gulf, solely to ensure the lights stay on across Asia. Now move west to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the southern entrance to the Red Sea. Historically, this 30-kilometer-wide gap served as the vital gateway feeding maritime traffic into the Suez Canal, handling up to 30% of the world's container shipping. But in early 2026, Houthi militants in Yemen weaponized this narrow strait, using cheap drones and missiles to target commercial vessels attempting to cross. When the group declared a ban on Israeli-linked shipping, the threat grew broad enough that major shipping operators paused transits through the region entirely. Almost overnight, the risk to crews and cargo forced commercial shipping companies to abandon the Suez Canal route. With the direct path closed, ships were forced onto the only remaining maritime alternative, a 3,000-mile detour sailing entirely around the continent of Africa. Those extra weeks at sea caused freight costs to surge, sparked major shipment delays, and contributed to a wave of global inflation. A localized militia used the physical shape of the coastline to bypass global superpowers and trigger a worldwide economic shock. With trillions of dollars in trade at risk, you might expect global markets to have a robust Plan B, but the options are severely limited. While Saudi Arabia and the UAE have overland pipelines, they can only carry a fraction of the volume that normally moves through the Strait of Hormuz. For the Bab el-Mandeb, the only maritime alternative is that detour past the Cape of Good Hope. It adds weeks of travel time, burns massive amounts of extra fuel, and introduces crippling financial expenses. By mid-2026, the global economy was left with no replacement for these waterways that didn't come with a massive penalty in time and cost. We coordinate global logistics with algorithms and engineer massive transport vessels, but we cannot change the unyielding reality of the Earth's physical map. Technological speed and market efficiency drive our system, but they remain tethered to geography. The stability of the world's energy and trade still depends on these few specific miles of water. These carrier strike groups represent the ultimate projection of 20th century force, tens of billions of dollars in mobile kinetic power. Yet a single, well-placed supply chain bottleneck can now paralyze an entire military-industrial complex without a single shot being fired. China has developed this specific capability inside specialized chemical laboratories, creating a choke point that exists entirely outside the reach of traditional naval patrols. Controlling the flow through these hidden, borderless nodes provides a level of leverage that modern missiles cannot replicate. To understand the mechanics of this leverage, look at the immense industrial scale of China's rare earth element infrastructure. China's dominance isn't based on simply owning the most rocks in the ground. Instead, they have cornered the market on the toxic, chemically intensive processing phase required to turn raw ore into high-tech components. This chart follows the transition from raw ore to usable material. The ore must pass through an intricate branching chemical separation process to isolate individual elements. It is a bottleneck that takes years and massive capital to replicate elsewhere. These wind turbines and the wider global green energy transition rely on neodymium magnets that are almost exclusively processed within this Chinese system. The vulnerability extends to Western defense. A single F-35 fighter requires hundreds of pounds of rare earth magnets for its guidance systems and flight controls. This dependency is built into the propulsion systems of nuclear submarines and the steering fins of precision-guided munitions. Beijing uses export controls on these processed elements to retaliate against trade restrictions, forcing foreign governments to weigh their policy decisions against the potential collapse of their tech sectors. Right now, a significant portion of the West's technological and military hardware is tethered to a supply chain that begins and ends inside China. Halfway around the world, China faces its own physical constraint: a narrow 2-mile-wide channel known as the Strait of Malacca. In 2003, President Hu Jintao identified this geographic weakness as China's most significant strategic threat, calling it the Malacca Dilemma. The map shows why. Roughly 80% of China's imported oil, fuel for its massive industrial base, must squeeze through this single congested waterway. This funnel also carries 2/3 of China's total global trade volume, concentrating the country's entire economic survival into a few miles of water. This lifeline is bordered by sovereign neighbors and patrolled by foreign navies, leaving China's economy vulnerable to a maritime blockade it cannot easily break. China is frantically building land corridors through Pakistan and Myanmar to bypass the sea, spending hundreds of billions to connect its factories directly to the Middle East and Russia. However, trucks and trains cannot match the sheer volume of a deep-water tanker. These alternative routes lack the capacity to sustain China's economy if the Malacca Strait ever closes. Despite its dominance in the supply chains of the future, China remains hostage to a physical stretch of ocean it does not control. This highlights a unique geopolitical standoff between two very different types of power. China holds an artificial monopoly on the processing required for the West's most advanced defense and energy technologies. Meanwhile, the West and its allies occupy the geographic positions necessary to physically halt the energy flows that keep the Chinese economy alive. Superpower competition in the 21st century is increasingly defined by this tension. The ability to identify and eventually squeeze an opponent's most vital geographic choke points. When a 400-meter container ship wedges itself sideways in the Suez Canal, we tend to treat it as a freak accident, a temporary regional headache that delays some couches and car parts. But modern global trade is not a collection of independent locations. It operates as a tightly wound biological network. Decades of engineering for absolute maximum efficiency have stripped away the physical redundancies that used to buffer us from shocks. In this network, a failure in one node radiates outward, forcing the simultaneous collapse of multiple other choke points. This is the compound crisis, a scenario where the world's shortcuts fail together. Surviving the next decade requires understanding how this physical grid actually works, and how easily a localized conflict can destabilize the entire system. The most volatile tripwire on the board sits between Indonesia and Malaysia. The Strait of Malacca is the busiest shipping lane on Earth and the undisputed heart of Asian trade. This map reveals China's deepest vulnerability. 80% of its imported oil squeezes through a bottleneck less than 2 miles wide, the Malacca Dilemma. It's an economic lifeline patrolled by untrusted navies. Piracy is surging, while the U.S. quietly deepens naval ties with Indonesia. If a blockade ever stops the flow, the physical chaos will be instant. Over 60,000 vessels a year would be forced to abruptly drop anchor or find a new route at the same time. China has tried building escape hatches, rail and pipeline corridors through Pakistan and Myanmar. But these land routes are mathematically incapable of absorbing the volume of a global maritime fleet. A blockage in Malacca goes far beyond shipping delays. If China's energy supply gets choked, Beijing will likely feel forced into immediate, aggressive geopolitical retaliation elsewhere. That retaliation almost certainly points toward Taiwan. A crisis in Malacca instantly creates the conditions for a secondary quarantine of the Taiwan Strait. Taiwan produces over 2/3 of the world's semiconductors. A single company, TSMC, fabricates 90% of the world's most advanced chips, the ones required for every AI model and fighter jet on the planet. The 2020 COVID chip shortage was a minor preview of this reality. A total TSMC shutdown lasting even a few weeks would cause multi-trillion-dollar GDP destruction, freezing everything from consumer electronics to the global defense industry. Choke points exist beyond the water. China maintains an almost total monopoly on the chemical processing of rare earth elements. Because this is a refining bottleneck, you cannot solve it by just opening new mines. An export ban would simultaneously freeze the production lines for Western defense contractors and halt the green energy transition. There is no strategic reserve of advanced chips or processed minerals. An interruption of just a few weeks severs the supply chains required for modern defense and artificial intelligence. As the Pacific locks down, the pressure moves west. The collapse of Asian trade routes places impossible strain on the Middle East's energy straits. The Strait of Hormuz carries 20% of the world's oil, but following the regional conflicts of 2026, throughput has plummeted. Many commercial vessels now delay or avoid the route entirely. Nearby, in the el-Mandeb, asymmetric drone and missile attacks have already forced a massive maritime traffic collapse. Low-cost hardware is effectively holding global trade hostage at the mouth of the Red Sea. It isn't just the military reality stopping ships, it's the insurance markets. To avoid the risk of a strike, carriers are rerouting around the entire continent of Africa, adding weeks to journeys and sending fuel costs soaring. But there is a final, invisible layer to this collapse. Beneath the surface, nations are weaponizing the seafloor by severing the fiber optic cables that carry 95% of internet traffic. In 2024, cables in the Baltic were severed within hours of each other. The damage was linked to the Yiping 3, a bulk carrier that used its anchor to provide a perfect, deniable form of infrastructure sabotage. When physical routes are choked, state actors will pivot to weaponizing the global internet grid. In a compound crisis, there is no safe harbor. This risk assessment shows that we are often distracted by the wrong vulnerabilities. The Panama Canal is a massive engineering feat, but it handles only about 5% of global trade. It is more of a theater for political posturing than a civilization-ending threat. The true underrated threats are the industrial chokepoints, like rare earth processing, that take years to rebuild and rely on raw materials already under foreign control. For 50 years, we engineered our world for maximum speed. We built a machine that runs perfectly under ideal conditions, but we did it by sacrificing every layer of safety. The map is rigged with invisible tripwires. The live crises in Hormuz and the Red Sea are not historical anomalies. They are the early, active tremors of a compounded collapse.